All right, here we're going to talk about absolute value equations. And when we talk about absolute value equations and inequalities, you're going to hear me use a lot of vocabulary, like very specific ways that I'm talking about these problems. And here is why I'm doing that. When I learned how to do absolute value equations and inequalities a really long time ago, my teacher told me to just memorize this specific rule. Memorize this rule, and that's how you do the problem. So I memorized the rule, and I could do the problems, and I did fine on the test, and then I promptly forgot the rules because I didn't really know why the rules worked. But a couple years ago, I learned about this new method, which is basically explaining what you're doing so you don't have to memorize the rules, which is really nice. So pay attention to the vocab and the way that I'm writing these out. Especially for the equations, you're going to find equations is pretty intuitive, but it really helps when we get into the inequalities later on. So it might seem a little bit like, oh, this is so long. Trust me, it'll be worth it. So just a reminder, absolute value is the distance from 0 on the number line. And you can underline or highlight these in your notes. So distance, because we're talking about distance is always positive. Distance can never have a negative number. So distance is always positive. Absolute value is always positive. That's a review. And we're going to talk about absolute value as being like 4 units away from 0 or 4 steps away from 0. So let's talk about what happens when we have a variable inside our absolute value sign. So this one, how I would say that the absolute value of x is equal to 3. Now here's how they're solving the problem. I'm going to go ahead and write out what it's going to look like. So here is kind of my translation, how I would say this problem. I would say x, or a number, is 3 steps away from 0. So I'm looking for a number that is 3 steps away from 0. And if I want to draw that on a number line, which is going to be super helpful, I draw my number line, here's 0. Well, I immediately know 3 steps in the positive direction lands me at 3. So that's where my number is. But I also know I can take 3 steps in the negative direction, which would land me at -3. So that means my number could be landing there. So that means that my number could be living at -3, or it could be living at +3. And go back and check, is the absolute value of -3, 3? Yes, it is. Is the absolute value of +3, 3? Yes, it is. So my final answer would look like this. And these little squiggly lines right here, this just means my answer lies in the middle of here. I don't know, I generally like putting my smaller numbers first and then my larger numbers, but it doesn't really matter. All right, example 2, let's complicate matters just a little bit. This is saying the absolute value of a number plus 2 is 10. Now how I would write that, or how I would say that, my translation, is this value here. Whatever this x plus 2 is, I know that it is 10 steps from 0. This value here is going to be 10 steps from 0. So what does that look like on the number line? Here's my number line, and here's 0. I'm looking at 10 steps, so if I go 10 steps in the positive direction, that lands me here. That means that this value is there. Or if I go 10 steps in the negative direction, I end up at -10, which means that this value is there. Right here, I actually have 2 equations that come up from this. My first equation is this one. X plus 2 is going to equal +10. And from that, I know that x is going to equal 8. My second equation is going to be this one over here. X plus 2 equals -10. And from that, I know that x is going to equal -12. And then if I would like to write those 2 answers and just kind of combine them, my answer would be this. Okay, so what they're doing over here, it's kind of the rule. If you can memorize this rule, it's great. But they're saying basically the same thing. They're saying that if you have your absolute value and it equals 10, you have two options. You're gonna have positive 10, because that means it's gonna be 10 steps in the positive direction from 0. Or you're solving for negative 10, because you can also go 10 steps in the negative direction. So these things are these things right here, but if you can reason it out this way, you don't have to memorize the rule. It's really gonna help when we get to inequalities. All right, example 3. With this one, it's even more complicated because up here we have the absolute value all by itself. Here we have some stuff. We have it being multiplied and there's something being added. The very first thing you have to do is that you need to get the absolute value expression by itself. And that's just using your inverse operation. So isolate your absolute value. So in this case, I'm going to subtract 4 to get 3 times the absolute value equals 12. And then I'm going to divide by 3, because this is 3 times, to get the absolute value of x minus 1 equals 4. So this right here is now what we're going to do, like what we did in example 2. So if you have an example here where there's stuff going on, use inverse operations to isolate your absolute value. So you have an absolute value equals your number. Then you can go ahead and solve for it. So I'm going to translate this. It would be this value of x minus 1 is equals 4 units or 4 steps away from 0. And if I want to draw that on a number line, it's going to look like this. Here's 0. 4 steps in the positive direction lands me at 4. So I know that that value is going to live at 4. And then 4 steps in the negative direction lands me at negative 4. So I know that that value is also at negative 4. So now my two equations, x minus 1 equals negative 4, and I can solve for that. And then my other equation is this one, x minus 1 equals positive 4. And solve for that, and then again, final answer could look like that as well. Let's talk about kind of a weird example. Now, with absolute value equations, like with equations that are before, you should be checking your answer each time, but sometimes we get lazy and we don't, and we go, I know I got it right. With absolute value equations, it's actually very important that you check your answer. It's actually required, because sometimes we'll get the answer, like it'll all make sense, we did the math right, but because it's absolute value, one or more of the answers might not actually work when you put it back in. So it's really important that you always check your answers. And I didn't do that on the previous 3 examples. Naughty me. So let's go over an example here where something doesn't work, and we'll see why. Okay, so I'm just working, and I'm not really kind of thinking, I'm just working. X plus 2, okay, absolute value of that is going to equal negative 3. Okay, so I know that, and if I'm just using the rule, I go, okay, x plus 2 is equal to negative 3, and then I'm going to take the opposite of that, and x plus 2 is equal to positive 3, because that's what I was kind of doing in my other ones. I had a positive and I had a negative, and I set them equal to both. So we solved both of these. I solved this one, and I got x equals negative 5. And I solved this one, and I got x equals 1. Yay, I did the math right. But let's go ahead and plug our answers back in and see what happens. Let's plug it back in for this one. So I have negative 5 plus 2. The absolute value of negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3. The absolute value of negative 3 is 3. Does 3 equal negative 3? Oh, no, that does not work. Same thing with here. I'm going to plug in 1 in. The absolute value of 1 plus 2 is the absolute value of 3. The absolute value of 3 is 3. Does 3 equal negative 3? No, it does not. So what happened here? And so this is what your final answer means. That's just a fancy way of saying there's nothing inside of that. There's no solution. Let's take a look at what that means. We could have actually taken a look at our problem and just not even done any of this math and known that there's no solution. Because the absolute value, as we know, always has to be positive because it's talking about distance. But this problem is saying that I get an absolute value and it's a negative. But I can't do that. That's not possible. So just from this problem here, if I'm paying attention, I can automatically go straight to my final answer. There's no value I could plug into x to give me a negative answer as a result, because my absolute value will always be positive.